So a Broncos wide receiver reportedly got shot twice last week after leaving a club, and this story is actually insane. So I've got to talk about that story in detail, Jameson Williams responding to his suspension, as well as my most intriguing matchups heading into Week 8 of the NFL season right after. All right, first up, we've got to talk about Broncos wide receiver Josh Reynolds reportedly being shot in the back of the head last week, yet somehow we are just finding about this today. Before I get to the actual incident and everything that went down, here's a quick summary of Josh Reynolds and how he got to where he is today in the NFL. He's a 29-year-old receiver that Denver signed to a 2-year contract back in March of 2024. Before that, he was originally drafted by the Rams in the 4th round of the 2017 NFL Draft, and after 4 years with them, Reynolds spent a bit of time with the Titans before joining the Lions midway through the 2021 season. He then, the next 2 seasons, had pretty productive ones, with the best year coming in 2023 when he caught 40 passes for 608 yards and 5 tutties. This season, he was having a productive season with the Broncos as well. He's actually their second leading receiver despite being on IR, and that's exactly what happened. He was having a good season with them until he was placed on IR not that long ago, on October 12th, after needing to get surgery on a fractured finger. So that basically brings us to the here and now, because the shooting incident took place just 6 days after he was placed on IR. And here's the details. Janet Orovitz and Kevin Vaughn of 9 News released an article today detailing events that happened very early in the morning hours on October 13th. So yes, this happened nearly a week ago, but somehow we are just now learning about it. Apparently, Josh Reynolds and one other guy got shot after they were followed from a strip club. I believe 3 men in total were together in this group, with only 2 actually getting struck by gunfire. Authorities were notified about this shooting when somebody called 911 around 3 a.m. that morning saying he'd been shot, with a second 911 caller saying he's being followed and 2 of his friends had been shot, with him requesting an ambulance. Then there was even a third 911 call saying he'd been shot. So 3 guys, 3 911 calls. So of course, the police responded to this very quickly, and Broncos wideout Josh Reynolds was among the victims shot. Reynolds was actually shot twice, once in the left arm and once in the back of the head. Back of the head? How is this guy even alive? I don't know. Thank God, though, it was somehow just a minor injury for Reynolds. He's said to be okay, with the Broncos responding about this incident after the news went public, saying Josh Reynolds was a victim of a shooting on Friday in Denver and received treatment for minor injuries. Out of respect for the legal process, we will defer further comment on this matter to the authorities. And so far, here's what's been found out according to court documents. Reynolds was shot twice. The second guy was shot in the back, but all 3 of these guys that seemed to be in a group together with Reynolds all had scrapes from climbing over a fence. Basically, these guys left the strip club at 2:45 in the morning with no conflicts happening inside. Well, after Reynolds and company left, you could see one of the alleged shooters, Luis Mendoza, following them out of the club and getting into a vehicle. So Mendoza and 2 other vehicles ended up following Reynolds and his friends and began shooting at their vehicle as they got on the highway. The vehicle Reynolds was in took enough damage, I guess, that it would no longer drive, and that's when they all fled from the vehicle, and all the 911 calls were made, or somewhere around there, and all the 911 calls also then made more sense. Well, after all this went down, Luis Mendoza and the other, Burr Charlesworth, were both arrested in connection to this. Charlesworth maintained his innocence, saying he never shot at the victims. He was just helping a friend, with the bullets coming from the other 2 vehicles. One of them was, of course, Luis Mendoza's vehicle. Again, this is all allegedly as the legal process plays out. But apparently, this was a result or because of some prior conflict that happened between Mendoza and either Reynolds or somebody in Reynolds' group. And honestly, we may never find out the full details of this. Somehow, some way though, Reynolds only suffered mild injuries, which is pretty incredible, all things considered. I will say this. If all this happened from one of Reynolds' friends because of this prior conflict, he needs to find new friends. Anyway, from here, we will see what happens while the legal process plays out and see if Reynolds is fine to come back from IR and continue playing for the Broncos this season. He's eligible to return after Week 10, but for now, that's really all I have on this situation, and I don't know if either of these gunshot wounds that he sustained will keep him out any longer than Week 10, but if I find out anything else on the situation, I will definitely keep you updated. Next up, I talked about this in detail in yesterday's video, but Lions receiver Jameson Williams was suspended for 2 games after violating the NFL's performance-enhancing drug policy, and it was announced today that he will not be appealing the suspension. He also released a statement through his agent today, and in that statement, he said that the news of the suspension came as a complete surprise. Quote, "I don't take supplements or vitamins, and I am overly cautious about even taking over-the-counter medicine. At no time have I ever taken something in an attempt to cheat or look for an unfair advantage." He went on to say that he's ultimately responsible for what goes into his body and that he has to and will take accountability for this suspension. So yeah, we have no clue what he may have tested positive for that caused this suspension. Maybe rabies since he's got that dog in him, but honestly, at least through this PR-friendly statement, it appears that Williams himself seems to have no clue why this happened either. But let's be honest, there's a high, no pun intended, likelihood that his agent or somebody else wrote this statement on his behalf, and the whole "I have no idea where this came from" answer sounds a bit familiar. Take it back to last season when he was suspended for 6 games for violating the NFL's gambling policy. Williams said that he, quote, wasn't aware of the policy. He didn't bet on NFL games, but he placed bets on his phone from within the team facility, though he claims he didn't remember doing that. For what it's worth, the NFL actually reinstated him after 4 games last season following a revision to the gambling policy. But as for this year's suspension, if he really believes that he didn't put anything in his body that would be cause for suspension, then why wouldn't you try and fight it by appealing said suspension? I don't know. It's a little odd to me, but I do know the Lions are going to miss him the next couple weeks, especially when they play the Packers in Lambeau in what will be a huge divisional game in Week 10. But let me know your thoughts on Jameson's suspension and his response. Do you think the statement was just a PR stunt and he knew what was going into his body, or nah, you believe him? Now, speaking of receivers who won't be playing in the coming weeks, the Chiefs just surprisingly placed wide receiver Sky Moore on injured reserve with a core muscle injury, saying he's going to need surgery. Well, it was surprising because he hasn't been on the injury report at all this year, and he was a full participant in yesterday's practice. But Andy Reid said he came in yesterday with the injury, got evaluated, and that's when they determined that he's going to need to get that fixed and got placed on IR. Well, I will say the timing is certainly interesting, considering DeAndre Hopkins just got to town and hit the practice field for the first time today. He's now on the active roster, which meant in order to make room for him, you needed to get somebody off of the 53, and they did this by placing Sky Moore on IR. So the whole situation is just a little fishy as far as timing is concerned, and some are suspecting that this is actually not a real injury. I mean, if you were going to force a receiver to go to IR, Sky would certainly be the top candidate. He hasn't recorded a single catch this year and has just 3 targets for 0 yards through 6 games. From here, let's talk about some of the best matchups and storylines heading into Week 8 that I am personally pretty excited for. The Eagles are playing the Bengals in Cincinnati, with the Bengals surprisingly being favored by 2.5 points despite being 0-3 at home this season. Funnily enough, both teams are coming off of wins over the Giants and the Browns, so whoop-de-doo. The thing I'm going to be watching out for in this game is if Saquon Barkley can stay hot after putting up 187 total yards last week. The Bengals defense is not great, and they're allowing 136 rushing yards per game, which is 21st in the NFL. However, despite being 3-4, Joe Burrow is having a great season. He's 4th in the league with 14 touchdowns and has only thrown 2 picks on the year. And as a Chiefs fan, that is something I sadly cannot relate to. If the Bengals defense can manage to get some stops, then I like Cincy's chances in this one, but that's been their biggest weakness all year, so I'm definitely not getting my hopes up there, and honestly hope they lose anyway. Next, while the Cardinals and Dolphins isn't the sexiest looking game on paper, I'm mostly looking forward to see how Tua Tagovailoa looks in his first game back since he suffered that concussion in Week 2. The Dolphins have lost 3 of their last 4 without him, and their offense has been god-awful. They're dead last in points per game, averaging just 11.7, which is pretty freaking nasty. Tyreek Hill is also excited for Tua to be back, and he thinks his fantasy managers should be too.
We're back, baby. Strike up, man. We're back, baby. Start me this week, baby. Let's go.
Then there's a couple division rivalry games I'm looking forward to, with the first being the Falcons and the Bucks. Both teams are 4-3, with Atlanta sitting at first in the division thanks to that crazy win they had over Tampa in Week 5. The Bucs are home for this one, but they're going to be without Chris Godwin, who's sadly out for the season with a fractured ankle, and Mike Evans, who re-aggravated his hamstring injury last week and is going to miss the next 3 to 4 games. So yeah, the Bucs are probably going to rely heavily on Cade Otton in the pass game, as well as Rachaad White and Bucky Irving. Whoever wins this game, by the way, will have a lead in that division, so a pretty important game here for both teams. Next, let's go from the NFC South to the AFC South to talk about the Colts and Texans. These teams played in week 1, and the Texans narrowly won 29-27. The Colts lost in week 2 as well, but since then, they have won 4 out of their last 5 and are now 4-3 as they look to catch up to the now 5-2 Texans, who are coming off a loss to the Packers. If the Colts win, they'll have the same record as Houston, 5-3, but the Texans will still have the tiebreaker over them since they have a better division record. CJ Stroud is coming off one of the worst games of his career. He didn't even top 100 yards and was without a touchdown, but I think he bounces back this week against the Colts, who are allowing the 10th most passing yards in the league. The Bills and Seahawks could be a great game, though I think Josh Allen and the Bills are going to come out with the dub, considering they're putting up the 5th most points per game, and Seattle's defense is 19th in points allowed and 21st in yards allowed. Here's a crazy stat. The Bills lead the NFL with a +10 turnover differential. Again, as a Chiefs fan, I can't relate, but the Bills, man, they've been balling out, and Josh Allen is yet to throw an interception this year. This man has thrown less than 10 picks in a season just once in his career, and that was back in 2019. He's averaged 13 INTs per season before this year, so the fact that he's avoided them altogether this season is pretty wild. To be fair, though, he has thrown some passes that could have been intercepted, but defensive backs are essentially wide receivers who can't catch, so it makes sense that they would drop some of those Allen passes. That was sort of a joke, so please don't get offended. Anyway, even though Geno Smith is having a great season in his own right and actually leads the league in passing yards, they're going to be without DK Metcalf, who sprained his MCL last week, and I don't think they're going to be able to keep up with this high-powered Bills offense, especially with the new addition of Amari Cooper. And then on Sunday Night Football, we get to watch the Cowboys and 49ers play in San Francisco. The Cowboys are coming off a bye where they got to lick their wounds after the 47-9 beatdown Detroit handed them the week prior, and the Niners are coming off a loss to the Chiefs at home in which they lost their number 1 receiver, Brandon Aiyuk, for the season with a torn ACL and MCL. And while the loss of Aiyuk definitely hurts, he was having a pretty down year by his standards and was 3rd on the team in receiving yards, not even recording a single touchdown. Now, on top of the Aiyuk injury, George Kittle, Deebo Samuel, and Jawan Jennings, they didn't practice at least during Wednesday, so a bit banged up. Might not play in Sunday's game. Kittle sat out of practice with a foot sprain, but Shanahan didn't make it seem like he would for sure miss Sunday, so we shall see about him, as well as Deebo Samuel, who is fighting through a case of pneumonia and was just released from the hospital a couple days ago. Jawan Jennings seems like the most likely guy that doesn't play out of the 3, but again, we shall see. In spite of some of those players not playing, potentially not playing, I still think the Niners should be able to find a way to get the win, as the Cowboys' defense has been awful. They've allowed the 2nd most points per game, while the Niners have scored the 8th most points and have gained the 3rd most yards in the league this season. So there you go. There's some of the key matchups and storylines I'm going to be looking out for this week. Let me know in the comments which games you are looking forward to the most, and with that, I'll see y'all next time.